And are you ready?
Yeah. Okay, we'll try this again. Just going real fast, Nikola Tesla was actually sort of the father of wireless. He had patents on wireless communication and the theoretical work that formed the basis of it. And he said, if you wish to understand the secrets of the universe, think of energy, frequency, and vibration. And that's what this wireless is all about, and that's why it's so harmful. And so we'll go through that. So I'm going to talk to you about, well, we can even skip that. We're trying to move along quickly, so we'll go right into. This is your standard electrical grid. Notice all of the wires connecting all of the piece parts. That's the starting point, is a totally wired system. Also notice the circle in the lower left corner. That's your house. The big network is the grid. Your house is where the meter goes. Your meter is the tail on the end of the dog. It is not the crucial component of the smart grid that the utilities will try to tell you that it is. So with the smart grid functions, their key function is to deliver electricity where and when it's needed. Now there are subcomponents of managing power quality, improving grid reliability, improving operational efficiency, and then we get into some of the newer stuff they're trying to bring in, which is to integrate renewable energy into the grid. And there's this mysterious statement you'll see made, it's a platform for new products and services, really. A friend of mine had a talk with somebody from Consumers Energy for over an hour who's well involved in the grid, and they want to make it compete with Comcast. They want to put TV through your smart grid, they want to put phone service, internet access. You know what that means? Always on, always streaming. But right now they just talk new products and services like new billing, like time of use billing. There's a whole lot of stuff that's coming that they're planning, so we'll continue going from there. So this is what the Consumers Energy on the other side of the state is using GridNet as part of their, one of their partners for their system. And now you look at a totally different architecture. Now you have in the middle IP, which is Internet Protocol, IP networks, 2G, 3G, 4G, cellular and Ethernet. You've got internet connection for all of this instead of the hardwired old electrical grid. You've got it connecting on the lower left corner. You've got some of the integrated, the renewables like wind turbines or solar that they're trying to draw in. You've got in the lower right corner your home. Your home is not just the home with the simple meter anymore. As David told you, they want to put radios in every device, every appliance, every electrical anything in your home, and connect that all through what's essentially a Wi-Fi system. They have a different radio, so the meters have two radios, not just one radio. There's a radio to take back your measurements. There's a separate radio that talks to all the devices in your house. So you could have two radios at two different frequencies operating at the same time in your home all the time. Next. So what's coming in these new capabilities, I had looked at the various partners that Consumers Energy has on the other side of the state, and one of them for the radio is Qualcomm chipsets. They enable more real-time exchange of information to a new wave of smart devices, in other words, all your appliances in your house. Constant connectivity to ensure an ultra-fast, always-on connection to any device. And GridNet, that architecture diagram I gave you, they're going to have the state of all managed devices is known at all times. Well, if it's known at all times, it's not every 15 minutes. They have to be transmitting every second for them to know at all times. Connected in a more or less real-time network, talking to a central controller. This is where we're headed. Smart meters will be always transmitting, and all managed devices, means smart meter, thermostat, appliances, car charger, whatever, everything electrical, they're going to be tracking it all the time. David went over what the wireless smart meter looks like, but understand that they're emitting RF radiation into the home and into your neighborhood with every transmission. Next. So what are the utilities telling you about this system that they're putting in? They're going to say, well, it's low power, therefore it's not harmful. Well, I'll show you that low power is harmful. They emit less radiation than cell phones. Well, Consumers Energy's integrator, before Itron bought them, had on their website that the smart meter was using 4 times the power as a cell phone. So they're not less than a cell phone. And another scientist, Daniel Hirsch, a physicist, had come up with 100 times or hundreds of times what a cell phone emits. It has to do with how close you are to them, but there is far more danger with these meters than what the utilities will admit to. They'll say that it's only a fraction of the FCC guidelines. Well, who cares? The guidelines don't protect you from anything. At a small, at less than 5% of the FCC guidelines, there are all sorts of scientific studies showing health effects. They transmit only 4 to 6 times a day for a total of only 45 to, well, there's actually like 700 seconds. But the point being, 4 to 6 times a day when they first put them in. They can make them remotely, they can make them transmit as often as they wish. There is a meter in Germany right now that transmits every 2 seconds. So it's just controlled by software, and it's remotely controlled by software. Smart meter only record total usage like analog meters. They have 4 separate channels that they use to record various dimensions of your power usage. So it's very different from an analog meter. They don't cause fires or fry electronics. Well, people's experience says otherwise. Smart meter RF radiation does not pose a health threat. Again, thousands, not just hundreds, thousands of studies show how harmful wireless is to health. They say smart meter studies show no evidence of harm to health. Again, that's just a bald-faced lie. Smart meters are safe to install on homes and schools. Well, the World Health Organization classified wireless as a 2B carcinogen. The utility will say, no, they classified cell phones as a 2B carcinogen, not wireless. Well, that's not true. They came back with a clarification statement that it was the technology that they labeled a 2B carcinogen, not the device, not just cell phones. Next. Okay. So the functions of a smart meter, as David has told you, it's a billing device. This is, like I told you, it's the tail on the end of the dog. It just records the information as, again, what it's ostensibly, what your contract with the utility is they can put a device to bill. But with this two-way communication, the meter can react to commands that they send. It can change parameters like how often it transmits. And it can also change how much power is being emitted. There's all kinds of things they can change by just uploading new software and then changing the parameters from a keyboard who knows how far away. And again, that means hackers can do the same thing. More information is collected over the 4 channels, like how much draw an appliance uses when it turns on. When a motor goes from idle to turned on, there's this big pull of power, and it's that signature of the pull combined with the run rate that gives the information about what appliances you're using whenever you turn something on. And the data is collected in these tiny snapshots between 5 to 15 minutes initially, but that's going to change. And the meters are also sending other messages every few seconds. Even when they're only transmitting your usage 4 to 6 times a day, they're still going off all day long. Next. And even if you get the opt-out meter without the radio or the radio turned off, that doesn't solve the health problem, because the way these devices work, like a lot of electrical devices, they have what is called a switching mode power supply. What that does is take the raw electricity that comes into the house, so that's a 240 volt or 120 volt alternating current, AC current, and they have to step that down to somewhere between 2 to 10 volts for all of the little microelectronic chips and devices that are in the meter to make them work properly. That stepping down function causes problems. It generates spikes of high frequency transients or electromagnetic interference. You'll also hear it called dirty electricity, which travel along building wiring, radiating outward. It can also back up on the wiring all the way to the utility, infecting every energy customer in between. So anybody who's got one of these meters, all along the line, everybody in the line is going to be affected. So it results in interference with electronic equipment. It also causes havoc with biological systems, because we are electrical systems. Our body communicates one cell to another with tiny little electrical impulses, and it's interfering with all of that electronics. The opt-out arrangement of a digital smart meter without the RF transmitting function would not eliminate this problem. This is just inherent in how a smart meter does its measurements. It's just how it works. So a true opt-out is an analog meter, not a digital meter. So this is just a quick picture of dirty power versus clean power. Clean power is that skinny little line that's a nice even line, narrow little line going up and down. Dirty power is all the fuzz, all the interference like you can get on an AM radio. All of that hiss and fuzz is interference, and that's what makes people sick, and that's what interferes with electronic devices. Next. So when these meters are emitting, they have what they call omnidirectional antennas. Omni as in all. They go in all directions, so they go in a full circle like a globe. You will hear the utilities tell you that your house is going to protect you, and the metal box that the meter is mounted on is going to protect you from the RF. Well, that's not really a completely true statement. You will notice there is a divot at the back of the meter. The dark gray is the metal box, the light gray is the smart meter. There's a little divot in the back, but look at how much radiation, look at the red globe at the bottom. Yes, the red is darker in front of the meter than it is behind. You're still getting radiated behind the meter, behind the wall, on the other side of the wall from where the meter is posted, is mounted. Next. So what happens when every house has one of these meters? This is the DTE system. They call it a mesh network. And a mesh network is like a relay race or like handing notes in class from one student to the next student to the next student. And your house is doing the same thing from one smart meter to the smart meter next door to the next to the next. They can go through 40 smart meters before they get to the collector meter. So if you look at this diagram, you look at the collector in the upper right-hand corner asking, and believe me, it's a query response. It has to ask for it before it gets it. So the collector says, I need the information from the bottom left corner. That goes to the house closest, which goes to the one in the middle, which goes to the one in the bottom corner, who says, okay, here it is. Throws that over to the next house in the middle, to the next house in the upper right corner, to the collector. 6 transmissions for one house to get its information to the collector, and that's in a simplified version. It could be 40 houses, so it's out and back 80 transmissions for one piece of information. Now you start getting the multiple houses. And what happens is every time these meters transmit, that little globe I showed you, you can be affected by the radiation hundreds of feet away. So if your house is on a small lot, and that all the lots in your neighborhood are small lots, a number of houses are going to be impacted by each smart meter because you've got this big circle of transmission. So as you've got these meters transmitting, you have the circles of radiation overlapping. When you have simultaneous transmissions, wherever the circles overlap, it's doubling up on the radiation. It's additive. So what happens next? When you have a whole neighborhood of meters going off, they call it electrosmog. And yes, it is all additive, and it does get dense and thick like that, and your body feels every last ray of that electromagnetics. Next. Now we get to the higher level of transmission. So each little cluster is a neighborhood of relays to a collector, and then the blue network says all the collectors are then in a separate wireless network. They are connected, and you have all of the radiation from those devices, from all of the collector devices, and that's again another mesh network depending on the architecture. So you've got layers upon layers of this microwave radiation. Next. Okay, this slide shows you an actual measurement from its EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, did a 222-page report in December of 2010 about smart meters. And one of the things they did is they took a measuring device into a neighborhood, and they pointed it at a particular meter. So the stars are the measurements off of one particular meter. The lower blue spikes are other meters in the neighborhood. There's a legend in the upper right corner. So the blue is the actual raw data. The green is what they call an average. The way the FCC measures and sets a limit on radiation is an average over 30 minutes. So if these meters are only going off a few times a day, or even just, let's say, the average they say is about every 9 seconds, but those 8.5 seconds in between each of the transmissions are effectively zeros being added in with the spike of the measurement. So the green spikes are the averages. That's what the FCC would be looking at to say, do they meet the guidelines or not? The reality, this is a logarithmic scale like the earthquake scale. So every 10 units is 10 times. So the blue stars are 10,000 times the top of the green spikes. But what they'll say is, oh, it's well below the FCC guidelines. Well, because the FCC is averaging. They're not looking at what's really hitting you, which is the stars. The little squiggles on the bottom in yellow, they might be hard to see. That's sort of the background, other devices, Wi-Fi, and other people's cell phones and cell towers. That's background radiation. As you can see, this is far higher than anything you had in your neighborhood before. Next. This is just doing the math real simple. If you have a continuous signal, nonstop, and you have a range between the blue line, 48 and 51 on the scale, and you have another signal that's a pulse, an intermittent pulse, which is the way the smart meters are operating right now. It's about every 9 seconds they're going off. So you get a pulse and then silence, and a pulse and silence. If you have a pulsed system where it's 0 and 100 and 0 and 100, and you average that over time, you get the same number. So according to the FCC, these are two identical lines. Do they look identical to you? Your body doesn't think they're identical. Your body is reacting to all of those spikes. Next. So how many times are they really going off? Well, they'll tell you 4 to 6 times a day. Well, the 4 to 6 times a day, you see where that is? Meter read data. So they'll read it 4 to 6 times a day, but this was taken from, in California, they had to go before a judge. This is Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E out in California, was in court in front of a judge under oath, and they had to say, okay, what else besides meter read data? Well, there's network management messages, transmissions, time sync transmissions, mesh network, this is this handing off from meter to meter, mesh network message management. Well, guess what? When you start adding up the 6 plus the 15 network management plus the 3, this isn't a 20, this is the average smart meter for PG&E, 9,600 times a day for your mesh network transmissions. Total, almost 10,000 transmissions in 24 hours. That's the average. What was the maximum? The judge thought to ask that question too. Well, on a maximum, it's 190,000 transmissions per day. Next. What this means to you is the average smart meter, when you take the number of seconds in a day and you divide it by the number of messages, every 8.66 seconds. Average meter is transmitting once every 9 seconds. And they're very, very short, they're very, very tiny transmissions, fractions of a second. So when they add up these 10,000 messages, they add them up, they come out and say, well, they're only transmitting 45 seconds a day. How can that be so harmful? Well, try sleeping with a strobe light and average the amount of light between the dark times and the bright times and say, well, why can't you sleep? It's only like the amount of wattage of a small light bulb of a small night light. What's your problem? This is like spiking like a strobe light. On the maximum, it comes out to every half second. You end up with these meters going off 2 times per second. It may as well be continuous, except it's pulsed, which guess what? Studies have said that's 28 times as damaging to your health as a continuous wave. So this is a pulse, but it may as well be constant. It's twice every second. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the electromagnetic spectrum. This is physics. This is these little waves, these squiggles. When you're down here, they're great big squiggles the size of a building. Then they get down to the size of humans, and so on until you've got these minuscule little rays, gamma rays at the far end. I'm sure you've heard that too much X-rays is damaging. It's not good for you to have too many X-rays. That's because these tiny rays at the far right are actually very, very powerful. They call it ionizing because they have the power to knock an electron out of a molecule. And once you knock the electron out, now it becomes an ion. So it makes ions. It's ionizing radiation. The radiation at this lower end of these bigger waves, they call non-ionizing because it doesn't have, they call it the power to create an ion, but it still has the power in a different way to destroy DNA. It's not hitting it like with a sledgehammer, it's like melting the glue that holds it together. So it dissolves DNA. But it's not making ions, so it's non-ionizing radiation, and they say, well, that's safer. Non-ionizing doesn't have the power of ionizing, so you're okay. It's not really potent radiation. So the waves we're looking at for communication are called microwaves, and that's coming in at about the size of humans. There are several different frequencies they use, but different people are different sizes. It's about the size of humans, That's significant because your body reacts to it because it's the size of your body. So they've ironically picked some of the most harmful rays by the frequencies they've chosen. These have the most impact because they are similar in size to our bodies. Next. So the characteristics of these rays is that the higher the frequency, the right side of the chart, the deeper the penetration, like X-rays. At very high frequencies, the waves have the power to knock out an electron. At the lower frequencies, it travels much further. Think of foghorns. You get a low frequency. Those big, swooping frequencies travel a far way. And just a little note there, the human cells communicate with very, very low, they call that extremely low frequencies, ELF. So the human frequencies are at the far left side, at the low end. And a stronger signal will often interfere with or override a weaker signal. Next. Now, another claim that the utilities will give is, well, we're surrounded by radiation. After all, the sun is putting out radiation. We've grown up, all of civilization has grown up with radiation. Well, number one, people can get skin cancer from sun radiation, so it's still radiation. It's still not good for you. But the normal, healthy radiation, there is not, well, I should call it radiation, the frequencies, because it's the certain rays that have become radiation, but it's the frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies. The Earth puts one out just naturally. Just if you're standing on the dirt in bare feet, you're being affected by the Earth's resonance, which is 7.86 hertz. The hertz is how often it changes direction, how many of these loops you're getting in a second. So it's saying that you get a few loops within a second when you say 7.86 hertz. Your body grew up with that. Your body has walked on the earth as cavemen and whatever. That's healthy, that's relaxing, that's the frequency you really need to be at. Your heartbeat is 1 to 2 hertz. Your sleeping brainwaves 2 to 4. The awake brain 8 to 13. Overall, the different parts of your body, the different systems in your body are vibrating at a rate between 0 and 22 hertz. And these are all these very low frequency, extremely low frequency, continuous waves. These aren't pulses. These are the swooping, smooth, continuous waves. Even the sunlight, visible light, while it's at the higher end, 430 to 750 trillion hertz, it's also continuous wave, and that's significant. Next. So how much radiation are we talking about here? Well, if you look back, 1980, at least for somebody like me, 1980 isn't all that long ago. it's a few decades ago, but hey, that's my lifetime. It was 0.005. This is the unit of measurement you use for radiation. They call it power density. That little mu, that U is called, it's microwatts. So the mu watts, microwatts per centimeter squared, 0.005. Now in urban areas, and I don't even know this was from a presentation from 2 to 2.5 years ago, so I don't even know if that's correct, but as of this presentation, it was 0.4 to 100 microwatts per centimeter squared. The background radiation has increased 20,000 times from what it was in 1980. Smart meter mesh networks, as we showed you, there was the background radiation, that was the little yellow squiggles, and then you had the green, and then you had the blue. Smart meters are going to make it much worse. Potential chronic health effects could add to healthcare costs. People are going to be getting sick in droves. Prevention is the key. You need to use a precautionary principle and get rid of this wireless radiation for communication. Next. So what about these microwave rays? What do we know about them? Well, the intensity is called power density, and it does drop off sharply with distance. And that's what the utilities will say. Well, you're not going to be standing right next to these. Well, you could. If you're mowing your lawn and you have to go right up against the house where the smart meter is, you could bump into it. You're trimming your hedge. You've got a bush right next to the smart meter. There will be times you are right next to the smart meter. But they're right. It drops off with distance. But then the waves bounce. They'll bounce off of smooth, hard surfaces. They'll call that reflection. And the emissions, these rays, are additive. When 2 or more waves intersect, as we said with the red circles, they add together. It's the sum of the 2 or 5 or 100 or however many rays are intersecting. It's the sum. So multiple radio frequency sources and or reflection cause intersections, which gives you higher than expected power density. You can have your little formula that says if you're 10 feet away, it goes to this, and if you're 100 feet away, it goes to this. That's if there's nothing else around it for miles. But as we've said, there's all kinds of other RF, not just smart meters, there's cell phone towers and cell phones and Wi-Fi and hotspots, and there's a lot of other RF around you. And the damage done by RF is cumulative over time. Next. Now, what happens when these little rays intersect? You think of sunlight as one of the radio frequencies. We said that was at the far right, or further out to the right of that chart that I had shown you. When these rays intersect, just like you concentrate rays with a magnifying glass, what you're doing is getting these rays to all intersect at a given point. That's how you can burn a leaf or a piece of paper or whatever. It's by concentrating the rays. And yes, they do create literal hot spots. The microwaves create hot spots where these rays intersect. Interestingly enough, part of why a magnifying glass can concentrate the rays, it's curved. It's that convex curve. Well, what else has a convex curve? Your head, your eyeballs, your testicles, your ovaries. All of these curved surfaces have the same effect as the magnifying glass. They concentrate the rays at a point interior. So you get hot spots inside before you feel any heat on the outside. They are hot spots, and make no mistake, they are doing damage. Next. Now, I talked to you about size, and that size had to do with how the rays are received and affected on that chart where I showed about the different sizes. There was a study done by a Dr. Gandhi, University of Utah, where he did with MRIs or some tracking mechanism how far a cell phone can penetrate into a skull. Now, these are cell phones, but cell phones use the same frequencies that are used for the various components in a smart grid. So yes, it's a cell phone, it's the same frequencies. So you get an adult and you can see how far the penetration was and the amount of heat with that yellow patch. Then you look at a 10-year-old and it goes past the midpoint of the brain on an average 10-year-old. You get down to a 5-year-old and it's almost going across the brain. Children are much more affected by these microwaves than adults. The smaller curvature, it's a number of factors about children. It is that their skulls are thinner. It's that their water content is higher, and water attracts the microwaves and communicates the microwaves. It's their size. It's a whole host of features about children that makes the microwaves much more damaging to children than they are to adults. Next. So what happens when we get this assault of microwaves? Well, as David had told you, there are people who get sick right away. You get cognitive functions, people have trouble with concentration, memory, you get irritable behavior, people get more violent. Sleep disruption, headache, depression, discomfort, irritability, nausea, dizziness, appetite loss, also weight gain because it interferes with your hormones. Numbness, tingling, altered reflexes. All of this kind of reaction, these are related to changes in the electrical activity of the brain. Again, we're an electrical system, and our electrical communication is being overridden by these microwaves. And the cells are being burnt up. Some of the cells are being burnt up and damaged. And so you've got all of this disruption going on. Part of the problem, too, is the smart meters are going to be going off 24/7. This is not just a 9-to-5 thing. So normally when you get exposed to some microwaves, like on a cell phone call or using your laptop, you walk away. You go do something else. Your body has a chance to heal and recover. If this is going off every 9 seconds or twice a second, you never get a break. You never get a chance for your body to repair. So these are from scientific tests. The effects of these high-frequency electromagnetic frequencies is that affects the blood-brain flow. It affects the barrier in the brain that's supposed to keep toxins out. It makes it permeable. So toxins that were supposed to be kept out are now getting into your brain. And it affects how the blood flows in your brain. It's disrupting intercellular communication. Your cells communicate using calcium ions, and this is disrupting the flow of calcium ions. So you get damage to genes, you get DNA breakage. This was documented in an extensive study all the way back in 2004. Geez, that's 9 years ago. and you have long-term increased cancer risk. It's a known fact that DNA damage often leads to cancer. So this is a cancer risk. Next. So the reflex study found, the DNA strands are like this ladder, this twisted ladder, if you ever had that in science or chemistry. And these strand breaks occur at only 2.5% of the guideline limits. So yeah, the smart meters are well within the FCC guideline. Yeah, well within as in maybe a third of the FCC guideline. At 2.5%, you're going to get DNA damage. You're going to have strand breaks. Significant increase in both single and double strand breaks. So I mean, it's just, like I said, it almost melts it. It's like melting the connectors of the pieces of the DNA. You get chromosomal aberrations, changes in the proteins, heat shock protein. That's how your cells tell you something's wrong. Your cells have DNA that not just says, here's the blueprint to make another cell. Your DNA has a number of instructions of if this, then that. What do you do under different circumstances? So if your cell is assaulted, whether it's a chemical assault, a heat assault, an RF assault, your cell tries to protect itself by thickening its shell. It makes this, they call it a heat shock protein, and I think of it like shellacking wood to protect it from moisture. So it puts this layer of protection over the cell. If it keeps getting assaulted again and again and again and again, puts another layer, another layer, another layer, pretty soon nothing gets in, no nutrients get in, no toxins get out, it kills the cell. This unrelenting assault will kill the cell. And they've done studies and they found that the cells react to the RF with heat shock proteins. Your cells know this is very damaging. So this is very solid evidence. Mobile phone radiation, which is just wireless communication, which the smart meters use, damage genetic material and may increase the risk of developing cancer. Next. So this was a little bit more about the stress response. It was actually a study, Goodman and Blank did a study in '98, again, in Kultz and I can't pronounce her name, and Rev Physio in 2005. Again, this isn't new information. This is stuff people have known about for a while. So next. So the effects of pulsed. We talked earlier that pulsed was worse than continuous wave. The specific studies that looked at pulsed communications found breaches the blood-brain barrier, affects the neurotransmitters, in other words, the cell communication, affects testosterone hormone levels, decreases sperm production, affects the natural rhythm of the brain, so it interferes with your thinking, can affect the heart rate and heart rate variability, as David had said, that some people who are electrosensitive, their heart starts racing and gets irregular beats. EEG changes, disruption in sleep, reduction in learning, lowers hormones. One of the key hormones it lowers is melatonin. This is very important. Melatonin helps boost your immune system. Probably a lot of you take melatonin supplements because you know how important melatonin is. Next. So what happens when you reduce the melatonin? Well, you end up increasing cancer rates, increasing childhood leukemia, increasing DNA damage. You can get miscarriages, arthritis, increased eye stress, chronic fatigue. You get a whole host of problems. And if you look at the middle of the chart, according to the study in '97 and 2002, and another one in 2000, only 25 minutes a day of a cell phone use gave you this kind of a melatonin reduction. 25 minutes a day, and we said that the smart meters can be 4 times what a cell phone is putting out. Now again, it depends on how close you are, it depends on if you're in a hot spot, but that's all it took was 25 minutes a day to do damage, to reduce the melatonin, which results in this cascade of problems. Next. For other problems, Alzheimer's, motor neurons like Parkinson's disease. So it's affecting your brain, affecting the ability to learn, and it's doing brain damage resulting in chronic diseases such as ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. So there's, again, a host of problems with this assault of RF. Next. As I said, it's not new information. May of 1975, Naval Aerospace Medical Research Lab quoted, this has to do with the continuous wave versus pulsed. Variability in the waveform, pulse versus continuous wave, could compromise the validity of conclusions of tests they were doing on microwaves. 1984, U.S. Air Force, a 5-year pulsed RF microwave study, Dr. Bill Guy found an increase in tumors. RFIAWG is the RF Interagency Work Group. So this was a cross-section of different agencies at the federal government, FDA and EPA, and a whole number of different agencies got together and wrote a letter to IEEE. IEEE is the organization that actually sets what the guidelines are and submits it to the FCC, and then the FCC just adopts it. They don't do any research, they just adopt the IEEE. So this letter was sent to the IEEE with 14 issues. Again, 1999, we're not talking recent, 1999, 14 issues with RF limits. And the quote in the letter was that studies continue to be published from 1999. Studies continue to be published describing biological responses to non-thermal, extremely low frequency modulated and pulse modulated RF radiation exposures that are not produced by continuous wave RF radiation. Pulsed is worse than continuous wave. Salzburg resolution of 2000, scientists set a target of 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared for public exposure to pulsed radio frequency. The FCC limit for the frequency that the smart meters are at, 600. 600. Now, there's an entire book, I actually brought it with me if somebody would like to flip through it. It's also available on the internet, so if anybody would like the PDF, the URL for the PDF, see me later and I'll get you the URL. EMF and RFR research from the 1950s to the 1990s. The author, Robert Kane, has his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD in electrical engineering, especially concentrating in electromagnetics. He was a former Motorola product engineer, product design engineer, research scientist, developer of cell phones and microwave telecommunications. I have a friend who has a friend who knew these people, knew Robert Kane and the group he worked in at Motorola. There were 5 engineers working early in Motorola on designing cell phones and testing them. 4 of them died of brain tumors. So and I don't know if the last one is still alive, this was several years ago, but 4 of them died from brain tumors, including the author of this book, Robert Kane. I give you the link right there. So that's the link to get the PDF. Green is the link, if you want to copy that down. And one of the quotes from the book is, tissue destruction in one's brain may be occurring without the slightest indication that anything is happening. And the damage may be repeated over and over again each time the energy exposure takes place. Think of how many times you're exposed to any sort of wireless communication, cell phone, cell tower, Wi-Fi hotspots, and now smart meters. And every time there's damage being done because you're getting these hotspots in your brain. Everybody get the, everybody who wanted it, get the URL? I can show it to you later if I've got it on a chart.
Okay.
Okay, I can give it to you later. I've got it printed here, so I can give it to you later. Okay, the various health effects studies that I captured here, I could get a bunch of different ones. The International Agency for Research on Cancer at the World Health Organization states possible carcinogen based on the Interphone study, and they clarified it wasn't just about the cell phones, it's about the technology, the wireless technology that they said is a possible carcinogen. Dr. Magda Habas tested cordless phones. The 2.4 gigahertz is the frequency, it's the same as the home area network and what Wi-Fi uses. It affects the heart rate at 0.5% of the guidelines. The reflex study, like I said, 2 hours of 60 hertz exposure breaks DNA. It mutates the DNA, and then children's cells multiply much faster, so you're replicating the damaged DNA over and over and over many more times than an adult. Blood-brain barrier leaks after 2 hours of GSM exposure. GSM was one of the earlier forms of wireless, and it was the European form. It was also called TDMA. GSM was the European version, TDMA the US, and that's, I think, been migrated to UMTS, and I'm not even sure what the current one is. Difference is Verizon and Sprint are not using this. AT&T and T-Mobile use a version of this GSM, and that's pulsed. So that's more damaging than the continuous wave. We said pulse caused the heat shock proteins to be produced. Dr. Carlos at 2.4 gigahertz affects cognitive ability and memory. And then there's this next one, windows of effects at lower frequencies. You'll see another chart, a few charts up, that will show there's pockets of exposure that have an effect, And even if you go to more exposure, the problem stops because it has to do with the frequency and the parts of your body that it's affecting. And if it goes to a higher frequency or a higher intensity exposure, then you're not getting the effects anymore. And so it's a tricky business that it's like all over. It's like Swiss cheese. There's all these little pockets of where health effects have been found. Next, oh, you got that one. Okay, RFR damages DNA and fertility. So peer-reviewed published research shows damage to ovaries and testes. Barry Trower is one of the people who's very, very vocal right now, especially about Wi-Fi in schools. He came out of retirement. He's a British scientist, former naval weapons expert, specializing in microwave stealth warfare. Low-wave microwaves can damage the ovaries in girls. They have all the eggs they're ever going to have at birth. That girl could have a genetically deformed child, or she could be sterile, but she could have a genetically deformed child, and that could be carried through generations. Once you damage the DNA, you can't fix it. You can damage a cell and fix the cell. The DNA will give you the guidelines on how to fix the cell. But once you damage the DNA, that's it, it's broken. It's like taking the blueprint and smearing ink on a section of it or something. It's done. That's it. You're risking the future generations of your children with genetic disorders. This is Barry Trower. You can YouTube, he's got YouTube videos if you want to go to YouTube and just check Barry Trower. So as I said before, the effects on children are more intense. They're smaller, thinner bones, higher water content, cells rapidly multiplying, mutations are multiplied. This was an interesting one. I assisted somebody in doing some testing, some RF testing from smart meters. And we were at a school, we were at a grade school. We were walking away from one of the towers that was doing, remember when I showed the network with the blue network over the household network? So at the blue network level, they had a couple of those towers near the school, and we were measuring what was the amount there on the school grounds. Across the grassy field, it wasn't too bad, and then we hit the asphalt playground. And there was a little hopscotch, a couple of little hopscotches painted in permanent paint on the asphalt. And the RF jacked up because it was reflecting off the asphalt. You had actually more RF where the kids were playing. You had it out over the hopscotch, you had it where the little boys were playing basketball. The basketball hoops were on the asphalt. And so you had a lot more of the radiation there. And the earlier the exposure starts, the higher the health risks because you're going to be exposed for a lifetime. Most of us didn't have cell phones until adulthood. Your kids are starting like in grade school. How many years and decades of exposure and damage are they going to be exposed to? So you are really, really putting them at risk for health problems. So the next one. Here's the chart I told you about, the little pockets like Swiss cheese. If you look at all of these little light gray boxes, these all correlate to specific studies. Look at this level. Down at this level, EEG is altered in humans. And I can't even count all the zeros here. This is this power density where the US guidelines allow 600. It depends on the frequency. There's like a formula. So for the 900 megahertz, which is the frequency for smart meters, and some cell phones are 850, some PCS is 1900. There's different frequencies. So depending on the frequency, the amount of power density allowed is different, so that's why it's a big rectangle. So Canada, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, and the US all have, I mean UK is worse, but a bunch of us supposedly civilized advanced societies are allowing 600 microwatts. Look at New South Wales, Australia, 0.001 versus the US 600. You've got Look at China. You've got China who's putting lead in the children's toys and poison in the pet food. China has, look how much lower. They're at 10 compared to our 600. Bulgaria, Hungary, Russia, Switzerland. You've got a bunch of countries way lower, orders of magnitude lower than what our FCC is allowing. And yet the utilities say, well, it's safe because the FCC said so. It's well within the FCC guidelines. Well, guess what? Here's all of the different studies with the different health effects that were found, but you go up, you increase this exposure, and here you've got human sensation, and you go up, and guess what? You don't feel it anymore. You have childhood leukemia, you go higher, and they're not finding it anymore. It is pockets of exposure. And interestingly, this testing I told you about at a school, There was testing, and you take the highest measurement tested and the lowest measurement tested, guess what? It maps exactly where most of the health effects are. So this was measuring RF from smart meters. Next. So if we have so many studies that say there's so much damage, why isn't anybody doing anything? There are thousands of radio frequency radiation studies that find health effects, biological effects. The industry says no effect has been found. They'll tell you no study has ever found biological effects. That's just a bald-faced lie. Or they'll say the weight of the evidence is against, that there's any health effects. So what you'll find is for every study that says that they found health effects, there's a direct opposite study that says, well, we did the same thing, but we didn't find any effects. Actually, if you look closely, they're not identical. They change a couple of little parameters to make sure they get no effect. They're not identical. They'll claim it's identical. Well, we did the same study or close to it, and we didn't get any effects. Well, that was by design. So for every study showing damage to DNA and memory, there's an opposite study. How is it scientifically possible for 50% of all scientific studies to get an opposite result? I mean, if people are really testing this, there either is a result or there's not. How can 50% say the opposite? Well, a certain scientist who was frustrated with this, Henry Lai, in 2006, so that's already back a few years, he looked in 2006, he looked at 326 studies that were about 50-50 on whether they found an effect or didn't find an effect. Then he sorted them by who funded the study, whether it was the wireless industry who funded it or was it private funding. Guess what? 70% of the privately funded showed biological effects. Only 30% of the industry funded, and then they usually try to squelch it. They'll discredit their scientists, they'll say they made a mistake, they did something wrong. But by who funded it, that's why you have these opposing studies. So if you ever want to know if a study is valid, do some research on who the authors of the study are and who funded it, and you'll have your answer. Next. So scientists around the world, and I only took the more recent ones. Like I said, there was one that was back to like 2000, Salzburg Appeal. But almost every year you have scientists in different countries, scientists, physicians, researchers, getting together and saying, this is horrible. This has to stop. This RF is really, really damaging to human health. So this is just a list of a bunch of these different appeals saying, stop it, pay attention, get your government to reduce the guidelines by a lot. Helsinki Appeal, 2005. Benevento Resolution in Italy, 2006. Venice Resolution, 2008. Freiburger Appeal, also 2008. Porto Alegre Resolution in Brazil, 2009. Celatun Scientific Statement, that was Norway, 2010. Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe, 2011. Even Russia's on board with this. That this is crazy. They have lower guidelines than the US. So they had one that came out in 2011. Next. So how can the industry say it's safe? Well, what you'll hear is, well, the RF is well below the FCC limits. Yeah, but you've got all kinds of health effects below 3% of the limits. So who cares that it's below the FCC limits that are too high? The emissions are claimed to be less than a cell phone. Well, other studies find very differently. It only emits, this is one in the beginning, people would say, and you'd see people from different states. I mean, they were quoting Illinois and Michigan. I mean, I've done this in several different states. Just a little tiny bit of radiation. That's because of that green line, the green spike versus the blue spike. They're quoting the green spike, not the blue spike. That's unaveraged. It's not a little tiny bit. And you know what? The peaks, I was trying to get, okay, so what is the real peak measurement of a smart meter at a given distance, say 3 feet away? They won't give it to you. It doesn't matter who you ask. It doesn't matter how you ask. You cannot get that information. They know it's really, really bad, so they won't give you that number. They'll also say it's only transmitting 1 to 2% of the time. Well, you saw I did the math, and it was like 0.1% of the time transmitting was 2 times per second. So who cares if it's only transmitting 1% of the time if you're getting zapped every second? Next. So what are the FCC guidelines anyway? Well, they were based on the military. They were based on radar. And they were looking at how much exposure, in other words, how much is hitting you not how much a device is putting out, and yet when you get FCC certification, what do they measure? How much it's putting out. They're not looking at how much is actually hitting you. Because that has to do with other devices emitting, it has to do with reflectors, it has to do with a lot of things. You look into how things are measured and tested, they don't consider any of that. You get a little device all by itself in a room. I call it a soundproof room because they have like foam, zigzaggy stuff all around the smart meter so that it's not bouncing off of anything. So they're just getting the rays coming out, not the way you'd actually experience it. Okay, the FCC guidelines are designed to protect these military men, 6 foot, 200-pound, young, healthy men, from heating effects. That's the only thing, and they were only looking at surface heating, by the way. They weren't looking at the stuff that it penetrates deep into your brain. They were looking at skin surface heating. So protect from heating. They are taking that emission and averaging it over 30 minutes. Those big blue spikes are being averaged over 30 minutes. They also average it over the whole body, which also minimizes what your measurement is. They look at one device alone, like I say, in a soundproof room, one smart meter by itself, and yet you can find apartment buildings with 30, 40, 50 of these meters on one wall of a building, but they only test one device all by itself. Okay, this passes. And a single exposure, this is just unbelievable. They look at one exposure and say, okay, you can have this much of one exposure and it's okay. Well, guess what? You can have a single exposure of all kinds of things and survive it. You can burn yourself one time in your life and you're fine. You can get, a gunshot depending on where it is and you can survive. You can't be pelted with gunshots for your entire life. So a single exposure, that's all they're testing. Next. So the bottom line, FCC compliance is not safety. It's just legal. From 1993, an internal FDA memo. The available data strongly suggests that microwaves can accelerate the development of cancer. From a 2002 EPA letter, the FCC's exposure guideline is considered protective of effects arising from heating, a thermal mechanism, but not from all possible mechanisms. Therefore, the generalization by the industry that the guidelines protect human beings from harm by any or all mechanisms is not justified. That's from the EPA in 2002. Next. So what's missing in the guidelines? Well, they don't look at any of these health effects like melting DNA or permeating the blood-brain barrier or interfering with calcium ion flow and communication. They look at heating. Well, if your skin didn't heat up, you're fine. You're fine. They don't look at what's going on inside the skin. Pulse signal versus continuous wave, no distinction. I showed you the one that went 100-0, 100-0, came out exactly the same as one that went 48-51, 48-51, and they both averaged out to 50. There's no distinction in the guidelines between a pulse signal and a continuous wave. No cap on that peak that you can't get the utility to tell you how much a smart meter is peaking at. No cap. Emissions from other simultaneous devices. They should be looking at where is this device going to be used, what else is going on before any device, before any smart meter is installed. Somebody should be out there with a meter and saying, okay, well, how much radiation do we already have? How much is this meter going to add to this? Is there room to be compliant with the FCC guidelines in this given area? And you know what? You'll find urban areas where they are exceeding. As bad as the guidelines are, they're exceeding the FCC guidelines. It happens. They don't look at the accumulation of RF. Like I say, it's one single exposure. There's no guideline that says you should only have, like they'll even say about x-rays, you shouldn't have more than so many x-rays within a year or 5 years or whatever. Any radiologist will tell you that. But they don't look at that for smart meters and all the other things you're being exposed to. They don't look at how much can you safely have in your lifetime. No provisions for the vulnerable. Children, the elderly, pregnant women, anybody with some sort of medical condition. And they don't provide for nighttime periods for your cells to recover. They should mandate that all this stuff gets turned off at night. At least you have a chance. Your body could recover. At least you get a good night's sleep, which you can't get with the smart meters. Next. So what does this all mean to you? The FCC regulations do not protect against all effects. The low radio frequency mimics and interferes with intercellular communication. Residence exposure is much higher than the utilities will ever admit. Radio frequency radiation is a toxic accumulant. The effects of the exposure build up over time. Bottom line, wireless microwave communication is not acceptable for a smart grid. It's crazy. There are people you can write to and tell them that you don't want these smart meters, you don't want your health assaulted. So Tom McMillan, and David's going to go into more detail about it. Tom McMillan and his bill 4315 to eliminate opt-out fees. Attorney General Bill Schuette was saying the meters are not cost effective, don't charge it back to the not cost effective. And you can also submit to the MPSC 17053, that's the one for DTE. So you want to complain about everything to the MPSC. Cost, opt-out fees, health, fires, privacy, hacking, all of it. Next. Yeah.
Okay, what we're going to do now, we've got 2 more talks for you, but right now we want to take a very short break. Let's keep it to 10 minutes. We've got coffee and cookies and